he made all of his houses were only had a ceiling of 6 feet and 2 inches tall, which is really quite short, especially if you are a man and you are over 6 foot tall. Hi, this is Anita from the Dusty Roads podcast. Today I want to talk a little bit about Frank Lloyd Wright. You know, that famous architect that we all have heard his name, Frank Lloyd Wright. Recently, I went to visit Frank Lloyd Wright's house and studio in Oak Park, Illinois. And by the way, if you happen to be in the Chicago area and you are a fan of Frank Lloyd Wright like I am, this really is a wonderful place to visit. Not only is it a wonderful town, but also seeing his studio and house is really an experience. I highly recommend it. And one of the questions that I saw that was on the internet that people were asking about Frank Lloyd Wright was, why are his ceilings so low? So when I went to visit his house, I purposely asked our guide that question. Why are the ceilings so low? And his answer was because of what was known as compression and expansion. Yes, in many of the Frank Lloyd Wright houses, you will find that in one area you go to, the ceiling is low and you have this feeling of being sort of closed in, and he called that compression. And then you walk into another room and the ceilings are high, and he called that expansion. In other words, he wanted people to have this feeling of going into one area, feeling it's closed in, you're feeling compressed. You go into the next area and you feel it's expansive, that there's this very high ceiling. But what I found out later after I did some of my own research was what I was told was, yes, it was correct, but it was not absolutely the reason why many of Frank Lloyd Wright's houses have these low ceilings. If you know anything about Frank Lloyd Wright, he was not exactly the nicest guy around. He was notorious for things like even in his office where he would have clients that would be waiting for him. And he'd walk past them purposely many times. They might even sit there for a long time. And he would do that because he wanted them to kind of understand who's boss. Like, I'm the one who's important here. You're not important here. And he was known to be, really that way. He was known to have quite a few mistresses in his life. He actually was one of these guys that was kind of a character that many people really would probably call him a narcissist. That he really was somebody who believed in himself and his own, and how great he was. In fact, he would even say that he was a genius and he didn't take any type of inspiration from anyone else, which is absolutely not true. He worked for an architect named Louis Sullivan, who was one of the first architects who started doing a lot of the looks that Frank Lloyd Wright did. So this is kind of the background to talk about why Frank Lloyd Wright had his ceilings to be so low. Frank Lloyd Wright was actually not a very tall person. On his passport application, when him and his wife were going to Japan, his passport application said he was 5 feet and 8.5 inches tall, or 5 feet and 8.5 inches tall. His wife said she was 5 feet 8. There's many people who have said that Frank Lloyd Wright was not 5'8". In fact, he was much smaller than that. But that's, of course, what he put down on his passport application. We really don't know. There's some who've said that maybe he was as short as 4 feet or 5 feet. We really don't know because he always said he was 5 foot 8.5 inches tall. What we do know is that he was relatively short. Actually, because of that, he made all of his houses only had a ceiling of 6 feet and 2 inches tall, which is really quite short, especially if you are a man and you are over 6 foot tall. What we do know about him is that the doorways to his houses were only 6.2 inches tall, and that the ceilings were 6.4 inches tall. Now, this is actually relatively short if you are a man and you are 6 foot tall, which, is for many of Scandinavian or European descent. Some of them are very, very tall. Well, here's the reason why this is my scale or my perspective. He said, I took the human being at 5 foot 8.5 inches tall, like myself, as the human scale. If I had been taller, the scale might have been different. So in other words, what Frank Lloyd Wright's saying here is he doesn't care how tall other people are. He is 5 foot 8.5 inches tall. So that's the scale that he should do all of his buildings at, because that's the scale and that's the height that people should be. And if he was taller, maybe if he was 6 foot, he might have made a scale bigger. But because he wasn't, and he was 5 foot 8.5 inches tall, that's why he made his ceilings that way. He really didn't care if you were 6 foot tall. He was going to build his buildings and use the scale that he felt suited for him. And because it suited for him, it had to also suit for everyone else. The attitude didn't set well with a lot of Frank's contemporaries. And one of Frank's contemporaries complained to him about the scale of his buildings. And he said that, every time he came into his building, he found that his hat would touch the ceiling. And, complete Frank Lloyd Wright style, it was reported in this conversation that he said, well, take off your hat when you come into a house. For Frank Lloyd Wright, the problem wasn't that his scale of his ceilings was too short. The problem was that the man should just take off his hat and not worry about it. There's another story that was told by one of his students, whose name was Wes Peters. And he was known to be 6 foot 4 inches tall. So he was, studying at Towson, which is one of Frank Lloyd Wright's properties, where the ceilings were, quite low in many areas. And so, this poor guy, you can imagine, he'd come to study every day, and his head would brush up against the ceiling. And, Wright would look at him, and he'd get kind of upset, and he'd see this guy brushing up against the ceiling. And so he was known to holler out to him and say, "Sit down, Wes, you're destroying the scale." In other words, he didn't care that there were people that were 6'4" or people that were taller. What he cared about was that his scale, that as he saw it, for the ceilings to be as 5'8.5 inches tall, were the scale that his houses needed to be. Frank Lloyd Wright was a brilliant architect. I mean, there's no question about it. He's a brilliant architect. Even still today, he has a huge following. I'm a great admirer of his work. I'm a great admirer of all of his, all of his work and the things that he's done, of his buildings. But at the same time, it just goes to show that he was not always a really nice guy. And that's kind of the other side of Frank Lloyd Wright. That's kind of being told that he was not exactly always the nice guy. That, he believed that the standard should be set by his height and how tall he was, and not by other people's height. That he saw himself as the ultimate standard for how tall or low his building should be. He just frankly didn't care what others thought about him. I thought about this a bit, and I thought, maybe sometimes in life it's really good to be a bit like Frank Lloyd Wright and not really care what others think. Maybe that's what kind of in a way can drive this creative power like he had. He really, walked to his own drumbeat in a sense. He didn't follow what other people told him to do. He basically followed what he thought he wanted to do and why he wanted to do it. Maybe there's a lesson here for all of us to be learned. Not that we need to be narcissists or not be nice people. In fact, we can all do that. But maybe we need to sometimes learn to follow at our own drumbeat and be who we are, because that's who we are. And maybe that's kind of a bit of a lesson that we can learn here from Frank Lloyd Wright. We can learn to be a nice guy, not be a narcissist, but at the same time, learn to be who we are, because that is who we are. We hope you've enjoyed listening to our Dusty Roads podcast. If you have a chance, check out our blog. We have a blog about why Frank Lloyd Wright buildings have low ceilings. And I will put a link to another blog for this where I talk about the things which inspired Frank Lloyd Wright. If you enjoyed this podcast, leave us a comment or subscribe to our channel. We would love to hear from you, and we would love to hear if you have any comments or suggestions. Thank you so much for listening. We appreciate you.